The fog was thick that October morning, the kind that swallowed headlights whole and turned familiar roads into ghost paths. Miles Taylor was driving his usual route to the hardware store when he heard it, the screech of brakes, the sickening crunch of metal against oak, then silence that felt heavier than the mist itself. He didn't expect to find her there in the wreckage, a young woman in uniform with tears mixing with blood on her cheeks, one hand pressed protectively over her rounded belly. He didn't expect her to grab his wrist with desperate fingers as he tried to help, or for her dying words to shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. What he couldn't have known was that this moment of rescue would unravel a secret 5 years in the making, connecting two broken hearts through a truth that would redefine what family really means. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. October had settled over Millbrook Heights like a heavy quilt, all amber light and damp earth, the kind of season that made you want to believe in fresh starts, even when you'd stopped hoping for them years ago. Miles Taylor stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the fog roll down from the Cascade foothills in thick, gray waves that seemed to swallow the world piece by piece. The silence in the house felt different on mornings like this, not empty exactly, but expectant, like the air before a storm. Upstairs, 9-year-old Rihanna was still asleep, her wild auburn curls spread across a pillow decorated with painted horses, her small fist clutching the worn teddy bear that had seen her through every nightmare since her mother left 3 years ago. Miles took a sip of lukewarm coffee and grimaced. He'd been up since 4:30, the familiar knot of anxiety in his chest preventing any real sleep. The hardware store needed him by 7. Inventory was backed up, and Mrs. Peterson from down on Elm Street had called twice about her broken porch railing. Apparently, it couldn't wait another day. Everything felt urgent lately, everything except the things that actually mattered. He glanced at the calendar stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a wrench. October 15th. Circled in red crayon was Saturday's parent-teacher conference. Rihanna's careful handwriting spelling out, "Don't forget Daddy," in block letters that made his heart squeeze. Below that, in his own scratchy pen, were the usual reminders: grocery shopping, oil change, call Mom, the mundane scaffolding that held their small life together. The house around him was modest but warm, a craftsman-style bungalow he'd bought with grand plans back when he still believed in forever. Sarah had loved the built-in bookshelves in the living room, the way morning light filtered through the stained glass window above the front door. She'd painted the kitchen walls a cheerful yellow, hung curtains with tiny sunflowers, talked about the garden they'd plant together come spring. That was before she decided she wasn't ready to be a mother. Before she packed her bags on a Tuesday morning while Rihanna was at school, leaving only a note about finding herself and needing space to grow. 3 years later, the sunflower curtains were faded, the yellow paint was chipped around the edges, and Miles had learned that sometimes love isn't enough to make someone stay. He moved through the morning routine with practiced efficiency oatmeal, with brown sugar for Rihanna, black coffee for himself, lunch packed in the insulated bag with her name embroidered on the side. He'd sewn that bag himself, watching YouTube tutorials late at night until he figured out how to work Sarah's abandoned sewing machine. The stitching was crooked, but Rihanna had declared it perfect because you made it, and Miles had nearly cried right there at the kitchen table. Fatherhood, he'd learned, was equal parts terror and tenderness, a constant balancing act between protecting and letting go. Every scraped knee felt like a personal failure, every small triumph like a miracle he'd somehow stumbled into. He'd never planned to do it alone, never imagined he'd be the one braiding hair and checking under beds for monsters. But life had a way of reshaping your expectations until you couldn't remember what you'd wanted before. "Daddy?" Rihanna's voice drifted down the stairs, thick with sleep and morning congestion. "Is it school day?" "Yes, sweetheart," he called back, already moving toward the coffee pot for a second cup. "Come down when you're dressed. I made the oatmeal with extra cinnamon, just how you like it." The sound of small feet hitting the floor above him, followed by the familiar thump of drawers being opened and closed, brought a smile to his face despite the gray weight of the morning. Rihanna had Sarah's laugh, but Miles's stubborn streak. Her mother's artistic eye, but her father's practical hands. She could spend hours drawing elaborate pictures of imaginary worlds, then turn around and help him fix a leaky faucet with the focused concentration of a seasoned plumber. 20 minutes later, she appeared in the kitchen wearing mismatched socks and a dress that was slightly too small. She was growing so fast he could barely keep up with buying new clothes. Her hair was a disaster, sticking up at odd angles despite her obvious attempts to smooth it down. "Come here, wild thing," Miles said, setting down his coffee and reaching for the brush. "Let me help with that." She stood patiently while he worked, through the tangles, humming a song she'd learned in music class about autumn leaves and changing seasons. The domesticity of the moment, the warm kitchen, the soft brushstrokes, her off-key humming, should have felt complete. Instead, Miles found himself wondering, not for the first time, if this was enough. If he was enough, the fog outside had thickened, pressing against the windows like curious fingers. Weather reports called for heavy mist all morning, burning off by noon if they were lucky. Miles made a mental note to drive carefully, to leave extra time for the school drop-off route that wound through the hills above town. He didn't know. As he finished braiding Rihanna's hair and helped her gather her backpack, that in less than 2 hours his carefully ordered world would shatter like glass against oak bark. He didn't know that the fog concealing the mountain roads would hide a crash that would change everything he thought he understood about his past, his future, and the secret that had been waiting 5 years to surface. All he knew was that his daughter needed breakfast, the hardware store needed opening, and somewhere in the mist-shrouded distance, a routine Thursday was about to become anything but ordinary. The drive to Rihanna's school usually took 12 minutes on a clear day. In the thick October fog that had settled over the mountain roads like a living thing, Miles found himself creeping along at 20 miles per hour, his hands gripping the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup with white-knuckled intensity. The fog was worse than he'd expected, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly suggestions and turning the winding road to Clearwater Elementary into a navigation exercise that required every ounce of his attention. "I can't see anything." "Daddy," Rihanna said from the back seat, her voice carrying that edge of worry that always made Miles's chest tighten. She had her face pressed to the window, trying to peer through the gray wall that surrounded them. "It's okay, sweetheart," Miles replied, keeping his voice steady despite his own growing unease. "The fog will burn off soon." "That's what it does. It looks scary, but it always goes away." He hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. The weather radio that morning had warned of dense fog advisories throughout Millbrook County, with visibility dropping to less than 50 feet in some areas. Looking at the impenetrable curtain ahead of him, Miles thought 50 feet might be optimistic. They made it to the school drop-off line without incident, though it took nearly 25 minutes instead of the usual 12. Miles watched Rihanna disappear into the building with her rainbow backpack bouncing against her shoulders, and felt the familiar pang of worry that struck him every morning when he let her walk away. Single parenting meant that every goodbye carried the weight of, what if something happened to him? What if she needed him and he wasn't there? What if the fragile world they'd built together suddenly came apart? The drive from the school to Taylor's Hardware normally took another 15 minutes, following a route that wound through the residential areas of Millbrook Heights before joining the main highway that led to the commercial district. Miles had driven it thousands of times, could probably navigate it blindfolded, but the fog had transformed even this familiar journey into something alien and treacherous. He was about 3 miles from the school, following the gentle curve that ran alongside Whispering Pines Cemetery when he heard it. First came the screech of brakes, not his own, but somewhere ahead in the gray void. The desperate shriek of rubber against asphalt that every driver knows means someone is in trouble. Then came the impact, a sickening crunch of metal against something solid, followed by the tinkle of glass and the hiss of escaping steam. Miles's foot hit his own brake instinctively, bringing the pickup to a complete stop in the middle of the empty road. For a moment, the only sounds were his own heartbeat and the gentle patter of condensation dripping from the trees. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold, a woman's voice, weak and desperate, calling for help. He grabbed his emergency flashlight from the glove compartment and climbed out of the truck, leaving the hazard lights blinking as he jogged toward the sound. The fog seemed to part before him like a curtain, revealing the scene in terrible clarity. A dark sedan wrapped around the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree about 30 feet from the road. The front end was crumpled beyond recognition, steam rising from the destroyed engine, and spiderweb cracks spread across every window. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Hello?" Miles called out, his voice swallowed by the mist. "Can you hear me?" "Here," came the weak reply. "Please help me." Miles approached the driver's side of the vehicle, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog to illuminate the scene inside. The woman behind the wheel was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair matted with blood and a face pale as porcelain. She was wearing what looked like a dress uniform, navy blue with crisp lines and patches. He couldn't quite make out through the cracked glass. Her seatbelt was still fastened, but her position suggested internal injuries, and there was something about the way she held herself that spoke of deeper damage than what was visible on the surface. But it was her other hand that made Miles's breath catch in his throat. She was clutching her belly, rounded and unmistakable beneath her uniform jacket. She was pregnant, probably about 6 or 7 months along, and from the way she was breathing, both she and the baby were in serious trouble. "Okay, I'm here," Miles said, keeping his voice calm while his mind raced through everything he knew about emergency response. "My name is Miles. I'm going to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes found his through the shattered window, and for a moment something flickered there, recognition, maybe, or confusion. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. "Aubriana," she finally whispered. "Aubriana Hayes." The name hit Miles like a physical blow, though he couldn't immediately place why. Something about it tugged at his memory, like a song heard long ago that you can't quite remember, but can't quite forget either. "Aubriana, I need you to stay with me," Miles said, already pulling out his phone to call 911. "I'm calling for help. The paramedics will be here soon." But even as he spoke, he could see that soon might not be soon enough. Aubriana's breathing was becoming more labored, and there was something in her eyes, a kind of desperate urgency that went beyond physical pain. "Miles," she said suddenly, and the fact that she'd remembered his name sent another chill down his spine. "Miles Taylor." He froze with the phone halfway to his ear. "How do you know my—" "I know because ... Her voice was fading, each word requiring tremendous effort. "Because I've been looking for you. For 5 years, I've been looking for you." The fog seemed to close in around them, the world narrowing to just this moment. This woman. These words that didn't make sense but carried the weight of truth. "I don't understand," Miles said, but even as he spoke, something was shifting in his memory. Pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he'd been trying to solve. Aubriana's hand moved from her belly to reach toward him through the broken window, her fingers finding his wrist with surprising strength. "The baby," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his face. "Miles ... the baby is yours." The phone slipped from Miles's nerveless fingers, clattering against the asphalt as the world tilted sideways. In the distance, he could hear sirens beginning to wail, but they seemed to be coming from another universe entirely, one where such impossible words could be true. Time fractured. Miles found himself moving through the next few minutes as if underwater, every action deliberate, but dreamlike. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the fog with urgent efficiency, but all he could focus on was Aubriana's pale face behind the spider-webbed glass, and the impossible words still echoing in his mind. "The baby is yours," his training kicked in before his emotions could paralyze him completely. Years of volunteer work with the Millbrook Heights Fire Department had taught him to compartmentalize during emergencies, to push personal feelings aside and focus on what needed to be done. Right now, what needed to be done was keeping Aubriana Hayes alive long enough for the paramedics to reach them. "Aubriana, stay with me," Miles said, his voice steadier than he felt. He retrieved his fallen phone and immediately dialed 911. Again, his fingers somehow remembering the numbers despite the chaos in his head. "I need you to keep talking to me, okay? Tell me where it hurts." Her eyes fluttered, and for a terrifying moment, he thought she might lose consciousness. "Chest," she whispered. "Can't breathe right. And the baby. Is the baby okay?" Miles couldn't answer that question, didn't have the medical knowledge to assess internal injuries, but he could see that her belly seemed intact, no obvious trauma to that area. "The paramedics will be here any second," he said instead. "They'll take care of both of you." The 911 dispatcher came on the line, her voice crisp and professional. 911, what's your emergency?" "Single vehicle accident on Mountain View Road, about a quarter-mile past Whispering Pine Cemetery," Miles said, his firefighter training providing the precise location details. "Female driver, early 20s, appears to be about 6 months. Pregnant. She's conscious but has difficulty breathing, possible internal injuries. The vehicle struck a tree head-on. Emergency responders are en route, sir. Estimated arrival time is 4 minutes. Are you trained in emergency response?" "Volunteer firefighter," Miles confirmed. "I'm going to try to stabilize her until you arrive." He ended the call and focused entirely on Aubriana. The driver's side door was too damaged to open, but the passenger side might be accessible. Miles circled the vehicle carefully, testing his footing on the fog-slick grass, and found that the passenger door could be opened with some effort. "Aubriana, I'm going to come around to the other side," he called to her. "I want to get a better look at you, maybe make you more comfortable." She nodded weakly, and he could see her trying to turn her head to track his movement. The fact that she could move her neck was encouraging. It suggested no spinal injuries, though he knew better than to assume anything in a situation like this. The passenger seat was empty. Thank God if she'd had anyone else in the car. The outcome could have been much worse. Miles climbed in carefully, immediately reaching over to check her pulse. It was rapid but strong, and her skin, while pale, wasn't clammy. These were good signs, though her labored breathing still worried him. "How far along are you?" he asked, partly to keep her talking, and partly because some desperate part of him needed to know if the timeline could possibly match what she'd claimed. 26 weeks, she said, her voice barely audible. "Due in January." Miles's hands went still. January. If she was 26 weeks along now, in mid-October, that meant conception would have been in late April or early May. He closed his eyes, trying to remember what had happened 5 months ago, but the shock was making it difficult to think clearly. The sirens were very close now, and through the fog he could see the red and blue lights of the approaching ambulance painting the trees in chaotic color. Within moments, the emergency responders were surrounding the vehicle. Paramedics, firefighters, police officers, all moving with practiced efficiency. "Sir, we need you to step back," said a paramedic Miles recognized from his volunteer days. Kalen Croft, a steady professional who'd seen his share of serious accidents. "Kalen, it's Miles Taylor," Miles said, identifying himself. "She's been conscious the whole time. pulses strong but rapid, complaining of chest pain and difficulty breathing. She's 26 weeks pregnant. Kaylin nodded, immediately understanding that Miles knew what he was talking about. Good work keeping her stable. We'll take it from here. Miles climbed out of the passenger seat, but couldn't bring himself to move far from the vehicle. He watched as the paramedics worked with swift precision, checking vitals, stabilizing Aubriana's neck as a precaution, preparing to extract her from the wreckage. Every movement was careful, deliberate, designed to protect both mother and baby. Miles. Aubriana's voice called out weakly as they prepared to transfer her to the stretcher. He stepped closer, despite the paramedics' attempts to keep civilians clear. I'm here. Don't leave, she said, her eyes finding his through the crowd of emergency responders. Please. I know this doesn't make sense, but don't leave. One of the paramedics looked at Miles questioningly. Family member? Miles opened his mouth to say no, then stopped. If what Aubriana had said was true, if the baby she was carrying was somehow his, then what did that make him? I found her, he said finally. She asked me to stay. The paramedic nodded. You can follow us to Millbrook General. If you're going to come, you need to come now. As they loaded Aubriana into the ambulance, Miles found himself moving toward his truck without conscious decision. His hands were shaking as he started the engine, and he had to force himself to focus on the simple mechanics of driving turn signals, speed limits, following the ambulance through the fog that was finally beginning to lift. His phone buzzed with a text from Rihanna's school, asking if everything was okay since he'd never shown up to open the hardware store. Miles stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, family emergency. Store closed today. Family emergency. The words felt strange but somehow right. Whatever was happening, whatever truth was buried in the impossible claim Aubriana had made, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not from her, and possibly not from a baby who might against all odds and understanding be his. The fog continued to lift as they drove toward the hospital, revealing a world that looked exactly the same as it had 2 hours ago, but felt completely transformed. Miles followed the ambulance through streets he'd known his entire life, toward answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Millbrook General Hospital smelled like antiseptic and anxiety, a combination that always reminded Miles of the night Rihanna was born, equal parts terror and miracle, wrapped in the clinical efficiency of medical professionals who dealt with life-changing moments as routine. He sat in the emergency waiting room, his work clothes still damp from the fog, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Dr. Lysander Hayes, no relation to Aubriana, despite the shared surname, emerged from the treatment area with the kind of measured expression that experienced physicians used to deliver news that could go either way. Miles stood immediately, his heart hammering against his ribs. She's stable, Dr. Hayes said without preamble. 2 cracked ribs, mild concussion, and some soft tissue damage, but nothing that won't heal. More importantly, the baby appears to be unharmed. We'll want to monitor them both for the next 48 hours, but all signs are encouraging. Miles felt his knees go weak with relief. Can I see her? She's been asking for you, the doctor replied, studying Miles with curious eyes. Are you the father? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Miles opened his mouth to say he didn't know, that it was complicated, that he wasn't even sure who this woman was despite her claim to know him. Instead, he heard himself say, "She says I am." Dr. Hayes nodded as if this kind of uncertainty was routine in emergency medicine. Room 237. The nurses will let you know if there are any changes. The walk to room 237 felt longer than the drive from the accident scene. Miles knocked gently on the partially open door, waiting for permission to enter. Aubriana's voice, stronger now than it had been in the car, called for him to come in. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her dark hair spread across the white pillow, an IV line running into her left arm. Someone had cleaned the blood from her face, revealing features that struck Miles as familiar in a way that made his chest tight. She was beautiful, not in the polished way of magazine covers, but in the authentic way of someone who had lived through things and survived. "Them, you stayed," she said simply, and there was something in her voice that suggested she hadn't expected him to. "You asked me to," Miles replied, taking the chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was hit by a tree," she said with a weak smile. "But alive. The baby's okay. Doctor says everything looks good. They want to keep you for observation. But no serious damage." Aubriana's hand moved to her belly, a gesture so protective and instinctive that Miles felt something shift in his chest. Whatever else was true or false about this situation, her love for the baby was absolutely real. "I know this is impossible to believe," she said after a moment of silence. "I know you probably think I'm confused from the accident, or lying, or crazy, but Miles, I need you to try to remember. Spring training, Fort Braxton Air Base. You were there for the emergency response workshop." The words hit him like a physical blow. Fort Braxton, May 5th, 10th weekend. Miles closed his eyes, and suddenly the memory was there, sharp and clear as if it had happened yesterday instead of 5 months ago. He'd been selected to represent Millbrook Heights Fire Department at a 3-day emergency response training program, part of a civilian-military cooperation initiative. It was an honor he'd almost turned down, leaving Rihanna for a weekend. Always felt wrong, but his captain had insisted it would be valuable for their small department. "The conference center," Miles said slowly. "The welcome reception on Friday night. You remember?" Aubriana whispered, tears starting to slide down her cheeks. He did remember. The awkward mixer where uniformed military personnel mingled with civilian first responders, everyone trying to network while navigating the social dynamics of different branches and agencies. He'd been nursing a beer in the corner, thinking about how much he missed Rihanna when a woman in dress blues had approached him. "You looked like you'd rather be anywhere else," she'd said with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Pretty much," he'd admitted. "Not really my scene." They'd talked for hours that night about their work, their lives, the strange loneliness that came with jobs centered on helping others through their worst moments. She'd been deployed overseas twice, had stories that made his volunteer firefighter experiences seem tame by comparison. But she'd listened to him talk about Rihanna, about single parenthood, about the way his life had been reshaped by circumstances he'd never planned for. "We walked around the base," Miles said, the memory flooding back with startling clarity. "You showed me the memorial garden. Said it helped you think. You told me about Sarah leaving," Aubriana continued. "About how you'd learned to braid hair from YouTube videos, about the sewing machine you'd figured out so you could make Rihanna's lunch bag." Miles stared at her, seeing now not just the injured woman from the car accident, but the person he'd spent 3 days with in what felt like another lifetime. "Aubriana, God, how did I not recognize you immediately?" "The blood, the uniform, the shock," she said gently. "It's not exactly how I was planning to see you again." They'd spent the entire weekend together, he remembered now. Professional sessions. During the day, long conversations that stretched late into the night. On Sunday, they'd both known he was going back to his life in Millbrook Heights, and she was shipping out to her next assignment. They'd agreed it was better to keep it simple, no complicated long-distance promises that would be difficult to keep. What they hadn't planned for was the night between Saturday and Sunday, when conversation had turned to something deeper, when the loneliness they'd both been carrying had found temporary refuge in each other's arms. "You transferred bases the next week," Miles said, pieces falling into place. "Germany. I tried to find your contact information when I realized I was pregnant, but the conference organizers said participant information was confidential." I didn't even know your last name until I overheard someone mention you were from Millbrook Heights. You've been looking for me for 5 months? Since June. I requested a transfer back stateside as soon as I could. Got assigned to Fort Hemlock. About 2 hours from here. I was driving through Millbrook Heights this morning, trying to get up the courage to start asking around for a single dad named Miles who worked with the fire department. Miles leaned back in the chair, overwhelmed by the coincidence and fate and sheer impossibility of it all. The fog. If it hadn't been so heavy, if I'd taken a different route, we would have missed each other again, Aubriana finished. But we didn't. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. A nurse peeked in, a young woman with kind eyes and scrubs, decorated with cartoon stethoscopes. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's a little girl at the nurse's station who says her daddy is here." Rihanna Taylor? Miles felt his heart stop. Oh my God, the school. I never called them back. Aubriana watched his face carefully. Your daughter? I have to. Miles started to stand, then paused. Will you be okay if I ... Go, Aubriana said softly. Bring her back if she wants to meet me. I'd like to know the person who's going to be a big sister. The words hung in the air between them, full of possibility and promise, and a future that neither of them had imagined when they'd woken up that morning. Rihanna stood in the doorway of room 237 like a small sentinel, her auburn curls still slightly messy from the hasty trip to the hospital, her backpack clutched in both hands. Miles could see the wheels turning behind her intelligent green eyes as she took in the scene. Her father sitting beside a hospital bed, a woman with bandages and 4-line, the subtle tension that suggested this was more than just a Good Samaritan situation. Daddy, why didn't you open the store? She asked, her voice carrying that particular mix of worry and accusation that 9-year-olds had perfected. Mrs. Chun called the school when you didn't answer the phone. Miles felt the familiar weight of single-parent guilt settle on his shoulders. Every decision he made affected Rihanna. Every emergency pulled him away from the careful routine that kept their small world stable. There was an accident, sweetheart. I had to help someone. Rihanna's gaze shifted to Aubriana, and Miles watched his daughter's expression soften with the same instinctive kindness that had always amazed him. Where Sarah had been cautious around strangers, Rihanna had inherited something more generous, a willingness to see people who were hurting and want to help. Are you okay? Rihanna asked Aubriana directly, stepping closer to the bed. You look like it hurt a lot. Aubriana's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. It did hurt, but I'm going to be fine. Your daddy saved my life. He's good at that. Rihanna said matter-of-factly. He saved a cat from a tree last month, and he always fixes things when they're broken. She paused, studying Aubriana's face. What's that on your arm? On your arm. It's called N4, Aubriana explained gently. It gives me medicine to help me feel better. Would you like to sit down? I'd love to hear about you. Miles watched, amazed as his daughter climbed into the chair he'd vacated, settling in as if she'd known Aubriana her entire life. There was something natural about the way they looked together, something that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. I'm 9, Rihanna announced. I can ride a bike without training wheels, and I know how to make pancakes, and I'm learning to play the violin, but it sounds terrible. Aubriana laughed, a sound that transformed her whole face despite the bruises. I bet it doesn't sound as terrible as you think. I played violin when I was your age. Really? Do you still play? Sometimes. When I can find a quiet place to practice. Miles found himself studying Aubriana as she talked with Rihanna, seeing her in a completely different light than the emergency training weekend. There, she'd been confident, professional, someone who handled crisis situations with calm efficiency. Here, talking with his daughter, she revealed something softer, a gentleness that spoke of understanding what it meant to be careful with precious things. Daddy, Rihanna said suddenly, turning to Miles with the directness that always caught. him off guard. Why does Aubriana look like she's been crying? The question hung in the air, loaded with the kind of innocent perceptiveness that made Miles wonder sometimes if his daughter saw far more than he gave her credit for. He glanced at Aubriana, looking for guidance on how much truth a 9-year-old could handle. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're scared, Aubriana said carefully. I was very scared in the accident, and I'm still a little scared now. Scared of what? Aubriana's hand moved to her belly, a gesture that Rihanna's sharp eyes immediately caught. Is there a baby in there? Rihanna asked, her voice dropping to a whisper of wonder. Yes, Aubriana said simply. There's a baby. Rihanna's eyes went wide. How far along? Miles blinked, surprised by the sophistication of the question. How do you know to ask that? Mrs. Peterson next door was pregnant last year. She taught me about babies. Rihanna turned back to Aubriana expectantly. About 6.5 months, Aubriana replied. The baby will be born in January. Do you know if it's a boy or a girl? Not yet. I wanted it to be a surprise. Rihanna nodded seriously, as if this was a perfectly reasonable approach to pregnancy planning. Are you married? Do you have a husband to help with the baby? The directness of the question made both adults freeze. Miles felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he waited for Aubriana's response. No, Aubriana said quietly. I don't have a husband. It's just going to be me and the baby. Something shifted in Rihanna's expression. A recognition that Miles realized came from her own experience of non-traditional family structures. That's okay, she said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of someone who had never known a two-parent household. Daddy and I don't have a mommy, and we do fine. It's different, but it's not bad different. Aubriana's eyes found Miles's over Rihanna's head, and he saw something there that took his breath away. Not just gratitude for his daughter's acceptance, but a kind of hope that maybe this impossible situation might actually work. Rihanna, Miles said gently, there's something I need to tell you. Something that might sound very strange. His daughter turned to him with the patient expression she wore when she was preparing for adult news that would require her to be understanding beyond her years. Aubriana and I met before, Miles continued carefully. A few months ago, at a work conference. We spent some time together, and he paused, realizing there was no way to explain this that wouldn't sound insane to a 9-year-old. The baby might be your daddy's, Aubriana said softly, saving him from having to find the words. Rihanna looked back and forth between them, processing this information with the serious concentration she usually reserved for math homework. So, the baby might be my brother or sister. Yes, Miles said, his voice barely above a whisper. And if it is, then Aubriana would be like ... part of our family. Maybe, Aubriana said. If that's something you and your daddy would want. Rihanna was quiet for a long moment, her small face scrunched in thought. Finally, she looked up at Aubriana with clear, honest eyes. I always wanted a brother or sister, she said simply. And you seem nice. I think it would be okay. Miles felt tears he didn't know he'd been holding back slide down his cheeks. In the space of 12 hours, his carefully ordered world had been completely transformed, and somehow his 9-year-old daughter was taking it all in stride with the kind of grace that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with being her father in the first place. There's one more thing, Aubriana said, her voice gentle but determined. I need you both to know that I'm not trying to take anything away from what you have together. You and your daddy have built something beautiful, and I would never want to change that. Rihanna reached out and took Aubriana's hand with the unconscious generosity that children possessed before the world taught them to be careful. Maybe we could just add to it instead, she said. Like when we moved to our house and Daddy planted new flowers in the garden. The old ones were still pretty, but the new ones made everything better. In that moment, sitting in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and possibility, Miles realized that maybe the most important conversations about family weren't the ones adults planned, but the ones that happened naturally when people decided to be brave enough to tell the truth. 3 days later, Aubriana stood in the doorway of Miles's modest craftsman home, holding a small duffel bag and wearing civilian clothes that seemed to transform her entirely. Without the uniform, she looked younger, softer, more like the woman he remembered from that weekend in May than the injured soldier he'd pulled from the wreckage. "Are you sure about this?" she asked for the 3rd time since leaving the hospital. "I could find a hotel or temporary housing on base. I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Miles said, stepping aside to let her enter. "The doctor said you need someone to monitor you for the next few days, and Rihanna made me promise you'd stay here." It was true. His daughter had been surprisingly insistent about the arrangements, announcing to anyone who would listen that Aubriana and the baby needed looking after, and their house had plenty of room. She'd spent the morning preparing the guest bedroom with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for very important visitors, complete with fresh flowers from their garden and a hand-drawn welcome sign taped to the door. The house felt different with Aubriana in it. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with possibility in a way that reminded Miles of the early days after Rihanna was born, when every ordinary moment carried the weight of life-changing transformation. She moved through the rooms carefully, taking in the details: family photos on the mantel, Rihanna's artwork covering the refrigerator, the comfortable chaos of a home where real people lived real lives. "Your daughter has quite an artistic eye," Aubriana said, pausing at a particularly colorful drawing of what appeared to be a dragon wearing a firefighter's helmet. "That's Captain Smokebreath," Miles explained. "He's Rihanna's invention, a dragon who helps put out fires instead of starting them. She's been working on a whole series of stories about him." "She's going to be a storyteller," Aubriana said with certainty. "I can tell." The first week unfolded with surprising ease. Aubriana proved to be a natural with household rhythms, contributing without taking over, finding ways to help that felt organic rather than forced. She couldn't do heavy lifting due to her healing ribs, but she could fold laundry while sitting, help Rihanna with homework at the kitchen table, and prepare simple meals that somehow tasted better than anything Miles had managed to cook in months. "She makes the best grilled cheese," Rihanna announced to Mrs. Vance, their neighbor, who had stopped by with a casserole and barely concealed curiosity about the woman she'd seen coming and going from the Taylor house. "Does she now?" Mrs. Vance replied, her sharp eyes taking in Aubriana's obvious pregnancy with the kind of calculating assessment that small-town neighbors had perfected over generations. "She cuts the crusts off in triangles and uses 3 different kinds of cheese," Rihanna continued enthusiastically, oblivious to the undercurrents of the conversation. "And she's teaching me to play violin properly. Listen." The impromptu performance that followed Rihanna sawing away at "Mary Had a Little Lamb" with earnest concentration while Aubriana provided gentle guidance seemed to soften Mrs. Vance's suspicion considerably. By the time she left, she was pressing Aubriana's hand and insisting she come to the church potluck on Sunday. "The community here is wonderful," Aubriana told Miles that evening as they cleaned up after dinner. Rihanna was upstairs in the bath, her off-key humming drifting down through the ceiling like a small song of contentment. "They're good people," Miles agreed. "A little nosy sometimes, but good hearts. They're protective of you and Rihanna. I can see it in how they look at me, like they're trying to figure out if I'm going to hurt what you've built together." Miles paused in loading the dishwasher. "And are you?" The question hung between them, heavier than he'd intended. Aubriana set down the dish towel and turned to face him fully. "I hope not," she said honestly. "But Miles, I need you to know that I'm not here to force anything. If this doesn't work, if you decide that your life is better without the complication I represent, I'll understand. I'll figure something else out." "What do you want?" Miles asked. Not what you think I want to hear. Not what you think is best for everyone else. What do you actually want? Aubriana's hand moved to her belly, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. I want this baby to know their father. I want to stop being afraid that I'm going to mess up parenting before I even start, and I want. She paused, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I want to stop feeling so alone. Miles stepped closer, close enough to see the vulnerability. In her eyes, the way her shoulders held tension like armor she was trying to shed. You're not alone. Sometimes it feels like I have been for years. Moving from base to base, temporary housing, deployment schedules. I got good at making do, at being self-sufficient. But when I found out about the baby, all I could think about was how I wanted them to have what I never had: stability, roots, a place where they belonged. Is that why you were looking for me? For stability? At first, maybe. But after this week, watching you with Rihanna, seeing how you've built this life, Aubriana shook her head. I want to be part of something real. Not just because of the baby, but because of who you are. Who we could be together. The honesty of it took Miles's breath away. In the 3 years since Sarah had left, he'd convinced himself that what he and Rihanna had was complete, that wanting more was selfish or naive. But standing in his kitchen, with this woman who had walked back into his life through fog and chance and impossible timing, he felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to shift. Rihanna loves you, he said finally. I love her too. She's incredible, Miles. You've raised someone with such an open heart, such natural kindness. I keep thinking about what she said about adding to the garden instead of changing it. From upstairs came the sound of Rihanna calling for help with her hair, and both adults smiled at the familiar domestic summons. I should go help her, Miles said. Can I come too? Aubriana asked. I used to help my younger cousins with their hair. I might remember a few tricks. As they climbed the stairs together, Miles found himself imagining mornings like this stretching into the future: shared responsibilities, quiet conversations, the gentle accumulation of ordinary moments that transformed strangers into family. For the first time since the accident, it didn't feel impossible. It felt like something worth believing in. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Aubriana was helping Rihanna practice violin scales before school. Miles answered without looking at the caller ID, expecting it to be a customer from the hardware store or maybe Dr. Hayes with a routine follow-up about Aubriana's recovery. Is this Miles Taylor? The voice was crisp, official, with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. Yes, this is Miles. Mr. Taylor, this is Colonel Torvin Beckett from Fort Hemlock. I'm calling regarding Sergeant Aubriana Hayes. I understand she's been staying with you since her accident. Miles felt something cold settle in his stomach. Across the kitchen, Aubriana's bow had gone still against the violin strings, her face suddenly pale as she registered who was on the phone. She's here, Miles said carefully. Is there a problem? Sir, I need to speak with Sergeant Hayes immediately. This is a matter of some urgency. Miles looked at Aubriana, who was already reaching for the phone with hands that trembled slightly. It's for you, he said, though they both already knew that. Colonel Beckett, Aubriana said, her voice instantly transforming into the crisp, professional tone Miles recognized from their first meeting at Fort Braxton. Yes, sir. I understand. No, sir, I haven't received any messages because my phone was destroyed in the accident. Miles watched her face change as she listened, saw the color drain from her cheeks, and her free hand move protectively to her belly. Rihanna, sensing the shift in atmosphere with the intuitive awareness of someone who had learned to read adult moods for signs of stability or crisis, quietly set down her violin and moved closer to Miles. What's happening, Daddy? She whispered. I don't know yet, sweetheart, Miles replied, keeping his voice low. Aubriana was pacing now. As much as her healing ribs would allow, the phone pressed tight against her ear. Sir, with respect, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I submitted all required documentation regarding my condition. The medical review board cleared me for light duty until my maternity leave. A long pause. Then, I see. No, sir, I was not aware of that policy change. When does it take effect? Miles felt his heart rate accelerate. Whatever news Colonel Beckett was delivering, it wasn't good. Understood, sir. Yes, I'll report to Fort Hemlock by Friday to complete the processing. Thank you for the call. Aubriana ended the call and stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the phone as if it had personally betrayed her. Aubriana? Miles said gently. What's going on? She looked up at him, and he saw in her eyes the same desperate uncertainty that had been there in the car wreckage, the look of someone whose world had just shifted beneath her feet. They're discharging me, she said quietly. Effective immediately. Discharging you? Why? New policy regarding pregnancy and active duty status. Anyone past 24 weeks who can't perform full duties gets an administrative discharge. Her voice was carefully controlled, but Miles could hear the strain underneath. I'll lose my housing, my health care, my income, everything. Rihanna looked back and forth between the adults, her young face creased with concern. What does discharge mean? It means Aubriana can't be a soldier anymore, Miles explained gently, his mind racing through the implications. It means she has to find a new job and a new place to live. But she lives here now, Rihanna said with the straightforward logic of childhood. Why does she need a new place? The question hung in the air, highlighting the temporary nature of arrangements that had begun to feel permanent. Aubriana sat down heavily at the kitchen table, her professional composure finally cracking. I have to report to Fort Hemlock by Friday to sign the discharge papers and clear out my quarters, she said. After that, I'm officially a civilian, with no income, no housing, and a baby due in 3 months. Miles sat down across from her, reaching out to cover her hands with his. Why didn't you tell me your service was at risk? Because I didn't know, Aubriana said, tears starting to slide down her cheeks. The policy was announced last week while I was in the hospital. It's retroactive. Anyone currently past the 24-week mark gets automatically reviewed for discharge. They said it's about readiness and resource allocation, but it feels like punishment for getting pregnant. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place for Miles. That's why you were driving through Millbrook Heights that morning. You weren't just working up courage to look for me. You were desperate, because you already knew this was coming. Aubriana nodded miserably. I got the preliminary notice 3 days before the accident. I was supposed to report for review, but I couldn't face it alone. I thought if I could find you, if I could explain about the baby, maybe you'd help me figure out what to do. I never expected to literally crash into your life. And you've been carrying this worry the whole time you've been here. I kept hoping it would get resolved, that maybe the discharge would be voluntary instead of administrative, that I'd have more time to figure things out. She looked around the kitchen that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks, at Rihanna's school papers stuck to the refrigerator, at the coffee mug she'd been using every morning, at the small signs of belonging that had accumulated without her noticing. I should have told you from the beginning. You had a right to know that taking me in wasn't just a temporary favor. It was signing up for someone with no prospects and no backup plan. Miles was quiet for a moment, processing the information. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. First of all, you're not someone with no prospects. You're an experienced emergency responder with leadership training and a decade of service experience. That means something in the civilian world. Miles, second, he continued, you do have a backup plan. You have us. Rihanna, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention she usually reserved for important things, like instructions for caring for injured animals, suddenly spoke up. Are you going to leave us? She asked Aubriana directly. I don't want to, Aubriana replied honestly. But I don't know if I have a choice. You always have a choice, Rihanna said, with the confidence of someone who had watched her father make difficult decisions work out through sheer determination. Daddy says that's what makes people strong, knowing they can choose to stay even when things get scary. Miles felt his heart swell with pride at his daughter's wisdom. She had learned from their own experience that families weren't just about easy times. They were about choosing to face the hard times together. "What do you want to do?" Miles asked Aubriana. "I want to stay," she said without hesitation. "But I won't be a burden." "I can't ask you to support someone who can't contribute." "Who says you can't contribute?" Miles replied. "The hardware store has been busier than I can handle alone. I've been thinking about hiring help for months." For the first time since the phone call, hope flickered in Aubriana's eyes. "You'd hire me?" "I'd hire a partner," Miles corrected. "Someone who understands emergency response, has management experience, and makes better grilled cheese than anyone in town." The last part earned him a watery smile from both Aubriana and Rihanna. "Besides," Rihanna added practically, "the baby's going to need somewhere to live anyway. It might as well be here." The drive to Fort Hemlock took 2 hours through winding mountain roads that gradually opened into broad valleys, dotted with farmland and small towns. Miles had insisted on making the trip together, all three of them, despite Aubriana's protests that she could handle the discharge paperwork alone. Rihanna sat in the back seat with a book and her travel art supplies, occasionally looking up to offer commentary on the passing scenery or ask questions about what they would find at the base. "Will there be other soldiers there?" she asked as they passed the first of several official-looking signs marking their approach to Fort Hemlock. "Yes, sweetheart," Aubriana replied, "but they'll all be very busy with their own work. We won't be there long." Miles glanced at Aubriana in the passenger seat, noting the tension in her shoulders that had been building with every mile closer to their destination. She'd been quiet for most of the drive, lost in thoughts she hadn't shared, occasionally touching her belly in the unconscious gesture that had become as familiar to him as her smile. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I keep thinking about the last time I drove this route," she said. 3 weeks ago, when I was still convinced I could somehow make everything work out on my own. I had this whole plan report for the review, present. My case for staying on light duty, maybe get assigned to a desk position until after the baby was born. And now? Now I realize I was holding on to something that was already gone. The service I joined doesn't exist anymore, at least not for people in my situation." She paused, watching the landscape roll by. "It's strange, you know. I spent 10 years defining myself by my rank, my assignment, my next deployment. And in one phone call, all of that just disappears." Fort Hemlock appeared ahead of them like a small city rising from the valley floor, neat rows of buildings, precisely maintained grounds, and the kind of organized activity that spoke of thousands of people moving through their daily routines with military precision. Miles felt a familiar mixture of respect and unease as they approached the main gate. He'd always admired the dedication of service members, but the institutional machinery of it all made him grateful for the simpler rhythms of civilian life. The security checkpoint was efficient but thorough. Guards checked their identification, called ahead to confirm Aubriana's appointment, and provided visitor passes and directions to the administrative building where she would complete her discharge processing. "Feels weird being here as a visitor," Aubriana murmured as they parked in front of Building 47. A stark concrete structure that seemed designed to discourage lingering. "Do you want us to wait outside?" Miles asked. Aubriana hesitated. "Actually, would you mind coming in? Not for the actual paperwork, they won't allow that, but just to be nearby." The administrative office was exactly what Miles had expected. Fluorescent lighting, gray carpet, and the pervasive sense of institutional efficiency that characterized government buildings everywhere. They took seats in a waiting area furnished with uncomfortable chairs and dated magazines while Aubriana checked in with the receptionist, a tired-looking woman named Ira Vance who seemed genuinely sympathetic about the circumstances. "Sergeant Hayes?" Colonel Beckett will see you shortly. This shouldn't take more than an hour or so." Rihanna settled into her chair with her sketchbook, immediately beginning to draw what appeared to be the reception area populated by various fantastical creatures. Miles found himself watching other people in the waiting room, young service members with nervous expressions, families saying goodbyes or reuniting, civilian contractors with briefcases, and the brisk efficiency of people who did business here regularly. "Daddy," Rihanna said quietly, "why do people look sad here?" "Because this is where people come when big things in their lives are changing," Miles replied. "Sometimes change is exciting, but sometimes it's scary, even when it's the right thing." "Is Aubriana scared?" Miles looked toward the hallway where Aubriana had disappeared 20 minutes earlier. "I think she is, but she's also brave." "How can someone be scared and brave at the same time?" "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Miles explained. "It means you do what needs to be done even when you are scared." When Aubriana finally emerged from the administrative maze, she was carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression that Miles couldn't quite read, relief mixed with something that might have been grief. "All done?" he asked. "All done," she confirmed. "Officially a civilian as of 1600 hours today." They walked back to the parking lot in silence, Rihanna skipping ahead while the adults processed the weight of what had just transpired. It wasn't until they were back in the truck that Aubriana spoke again. "They gave me my service record," she said, holding up the manila envelope. 10 years summarized in 23 pages. "How do you feel?" "Lighter, I think. Like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time and didn't realize it until I set it down." She opened the envelope and pulled out a single document. "Look at this." Miles glanced at the paper she handed him, an official commendation for her work during a humanitarian mission in Southeast Asia, dated just 6 months before they'd met at Fort Braxton. "You saved lives," he said, reading the citation. "We all did. It was a team effort." She took the document back, studying it as if seeing it for the first time. "But reading this now, I realize something I didn't understand before." "What's that?" "The skills that made me good at that job: crisis management, working under pressure, taking care of people when they need it most. Those don't disappear just because I'm not wearing a uniform anymore." Miles smiled, hearing echoes of the conversation they'd had in his kitchen just days before. "So what happens now?" "Now I figure out how to use those skills in a hardware store in Millbrook Heights," Aubriana said with a laugh that sounded more genuine than anything he'd heard from her since Colonel Beckett's phone call. "And raise a baby," Rihanna added from the back seat, not looking up from her drawing. "And raise a baby," Aubriana agreed, her hand moving to her belly dot as they drove away from Fort Hemlock. Miles found himself thinking about the courage it took to walk away from one life and toward another, especially when the future was still uncertain. In his rearview mirror, he watched the base grow smaller until it disappeared entirely behind the hills, taking with it the last vestiges of Aubriana's former identity. "There's something I want to show you when we get home," Miles said as they reached the highway. "What?" "The business license application I filled out yesterday for Taylor and Hayes Hardware. I figured if we're going to be partners, it should be official." Aubriana was quiet for so long that Miles worried he'd overstepped. Then she reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Taylor and Hayes," she said, testing the sound of it. "I like that." In the back seat, Rihanna looked up from her sketchbook with a satisfied expression. "I drew us at the new store," she announced. "All 4 of us." "All 4? Miles asked. "You, me, Aubriana, and the baby," Rihanna explained matter-of-factly. "It's going to be the best hardware store ever." It happened on a Saturday morning in November, 3 weeks after the trip to Fort Hemlock. While Miles was teaching Rihanna how to properly measure lumber for the treehouse they'd been planning to build in the backyard oak, Aubriana had been helping with the project, sketching design ideas and calculating load weights with the precision of someone whose training had included structural engineering, when she suddenly went very still. "Miles," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tone that made him immediately stop what he was doing and turn toward her. She was standing beside their makeshift workbench, 2 sawhorses and a piece of plywood that served as their planning headquarters. One hand braced against the surface, the other pressed to her lower back. Her face had gone pale, and there was something in her expression that triggered every emergency response instinct he'd ever developed. "What's wrong?" Miles asked, already moving toward her. I think something's happening," Aubriana said, her breathing becoming more deliberate. "These aren't the practice contractions I've been having. These feel different." Miles felt his heart rate spike. How different, stronger, more regular. She closed her eyes, concentrating. "And they're coming about every 8 minutes. But you're only 29 weeks, Miles said, as if stating the fact could somehow change the reality of the situation. "I know," Aubriana replied, managing a weak smile. Apparently the baby didn't get the memo about timing. Rihanna, who had been absorbed in arranging wood screws by size, looked up with the sharp attention that meant she'd registered something important was happening. "Is the baby coming now?" "It might be, sweetheart," Miles said, his mind already shifting into emergency mode. "We need to get to the hospital." The next 20 minutes unfolded with the kind of controlled urgency that Miles recognized from his firefighter training. Move fast, but don't panic. Prioritize the essentials. Communicate clearly. While Aubriana timed contractions and breathed through them with the focused determination of someone who had trained for high-pressure situations, Miles gathered the hospital bag they'd packed weeks earlier and called Dr. Hayes to alert him they were on their way. Rihanna proved remarkably calm for a 9-year-old facing her first family medical emergency. She collected Aubriana's pillow from the couch, filled a water bottle without being asked, and sat in the back seat during the drive to Millbrook General with the quiet alertness of someone ready to help however she could. "How are you doing back there?" Miles called to Aubriana, who was breathing through another contraction. "Still okay," she replied, though her voice was tighter than it had been at home. "But they're definitely getting stronger." The emergency entrance at Millbrook General was a flurry of efficient activity the moment they arrived. Dr. Hayes met them at the door, with a wheelchair and the kind of calm professionalism that immediately made everyone feel safer. "Let's get you upstairs and see what this little one is thinking," he said to Aubriana as they moved toward the elevators. The next few hours passed in a blur of monitoring equipment, medical consultations, and the strange combination of waiting and urgency that characterized early labor. Aubriana's contractions continued, but didn't progress rapidly, giving the medical team time to administer medications to help the baby's lungs develop and discuss the various scenarios they might face. 29 weeks is early but manageable, Dr. Hayes explained to Miles and Rihanna during one of their brief consultations in the hallway. "We have an excellent neonatal intensive care unit here, and babies born at this stage have very good outcomes with proper care." "What does that mean exactly?" Rihanna asked with the directness that Miles had come to appreciate about his daughter's approach to difficult topics. "It means the baby will need to stay in the hospital for a while after being born," Dr. Hayes said, crouching down to speak to her at eye level. "There will be special equipment to help with breathing and eating until the baby gets stronger. But lots of babies who are born early grow up to be perfectly healthy." As afternoon turned to evening, it became clear that this was indeed the day their family would officially become 4. Aubriana's labor progressed steadily but not dangerously, giving them time to adjust to the reality that they were about to meet the baby several weeks ahead of schedule. "Are you scared?" Rihanna asked Aubriana during a quiet moment when the contractions had spaced out slightly. "A little," Aubriana admitted, "but not as scared as I would have been a few months ago." "Why not?" "Because a few months ago, I thought I'd be doing this alone. Now I know I have your daddy, and I have you, and whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Miles felt something shift in his chest as he listened to this exchange. The woman lying in the hospital bed was no longer the desperate stranger he'd pulled from a wrecked car in the fog. She was the mother of his daughter's future sibling, his business partner, and if he was being honest with himself, someone he was falling in love with all over again, not just with the memory of their weekend together, but with who she had become in their daily life. "Aubriana," he said, taking her hand as another contraction began to build. "When this is over, when we're all home and settled, I want to talk about making this permanent." "Making what permanent?" she asked, breathing through the intensity. "All of it. The partnership, the family, the life we're building together. I want to make it official." Aubriana's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with physical pain. "Are you proposing to me in a hospital room while I'm in labor?" "I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is temporary," Miles said. "I'm proposing that we choose each other, officially and completely." "What does that mean exactly?" Rihanna asked, echoing her earlier question with a grin that suggested she already knew the answer. "It means we're going to be a real family," Aubriana said, squeezing Miles's hand as the contraction peaked. "All four of us." 3 hours later, Caspian Wild Taylor Hayes entered the world weighing 4 pounds 2 ounces with a fierce cry that announced his determination to thrive despite his early arrival. As Miles held his son for the first time, this tiny, perfect person who had somehow brought together all the scattered pieces of their lives, he realized that some of the most important things in life couldn't be planned or controlled. They could only be embraced when they arrived, wrapped in fog and chance and the infinite possibility of love that was brave enough to say yes to the unexpected. The NICU at Millbrook General became their second home for the next 6 weeks. Every morning, Miles would drop Rihanna at school, then drive to the hospital where Aubriana was already settled in the rocking chair beside Caspian's Isolette, her hand reaching through the porthole to stroke his tiny fingers while she read aloud from the collection of storybooks that had accumulated on the windowsill. "Good morning, little man," Miles would whisper to his son each day, marveling at how much Caspian had grown overnight. At 29 weeks, he'd been smaller than most dolls, his skin translucent and delicate, but with each passing day he became more substantial, more present, more undeniably theirs. The nursing staff had quickly learned to work around the rhythms of their unusual family. Hyacinth Sterling, the head NICU nurse, had initially been cautious about allowing so much family involvement, but Rihanna's careful attention to hand-washing protocols and quiet respect for the medical equipment had won her over completely. "That girl has the makings of an excellent nurse herself," Hyacinth told Miles one afternoon as they watched Rihanna help Aubriana change Caspian's diaper with the focused concentration of someone performing surgery. "She understands that the babies here need extra gentleness." It was true. Rihanna had adapted to the NICU environment with remarkable maturity, learning to speak in whispers, to sanitize her hands without being reminded, and to find quiet activities that wouldn't disturb the other families navigating their own medical journeys. She'd brought her violin one day and played soft lullabies for all the babies, earning applause from exhausted parents who hadn't heard music in weeks. The hardware store had remained closed for the first week after Caspian's birth, with a sign on the door explaining family emergency, reopening soon. Miles had worried about losing customers, but when they finally did reopen, they found that word had spread through Millbrook Heights about the early arrival and the reason for the closure. Instead of complaints about the inconvenience, they received an endless stream of congratulations, offers of help, and the kind of community support that reminded Miles why he'd never wanted to live anywhere else. Mrs. Vance had organized a meal train that kept their refrigerator stocked for weeks. Gwenvale Beckett from the bank had stopped by to discuss small business loans for the hardware store expansion they'd been planning. Even Pastor Finch from the community church had made a point of visiting the NICU to offer blessings for Caspian's continued health, despite the fact that none of them were regular attendees. "This town has really embraced you," Miles told Aubriana one evening as they drove home from the hospital together, leaving Caspian in the capable hands of the night nursing staff. "They've embraced us," Aubriana corrected gently. "I think they see that we're serious about building something here, about being part of the community instead of just passing through." The business partnership had evolved naturally during the weeks of hospital visits. While Aubriana spent mornings at the NICU, Miles would open the store and handle the early customers. In the afternoons, they'd switch roles, Miles taking his turn at the hospital while Aubriana worked the hardware store with the kind of practical competence that quickly won over even the most skeptical customers. "She knows more about electrical systems than some of the contractors," reported Corliss Hayes, the town's only female electrician, after Aubriana had helped her locate some hard-to-find components for a restoration project. "And she actually listens when you explain what you're trying to accomplish, instead of just trying to sell you the most expensive option." The evenings had become their own kind of sacred time. After dinner and homework and the bedtime routines that anchored their days, Miles and Aubriana would sit on the front porch swing he'd built for four and plan their future with the detailed attention of people who had learned not to take stability for granted. "I want to expand the store's emergency supply section," Aubriana said one night in early December, her head resting against Miles's shoulder as they watched snow begin to fall. "A lot of the rural properties around here aren't prepared for extended power outages or severe weather. We could stock generators, battery banks, emergency communications equipment." "Using your background," Miles said, understanding immediately where her thinking was leading. "Exactly. Turn the military training into something that helps the civilian community. Emergency preparedness consulting, maybe disaster response workshops. Show people how to be ready for the unexpected." Miles smiled, recognizing the same impulse that had driven him to volunteer firefighting. "I like it. We could partner with the county emergency management office, maybe get certified as a community response center." It was exactly the kind of conversation that would have been impossible just a few months earlier, when their lives had been shaped by isolation and uncertainty instead of shared purpose and mutual support. The intimacy of planning a future together felt revolutionary to Miles, who had spent 3 years convinced that his capacity for partnership had died with his marriage to Sarah. The question of marriage itself remained gently unresolved between them. Miles's hospital room proposal had been acknowledged and accepted in principle, but the practical details had been set aside in favor of more immediate concerns. They were living as a family, raising children together, building a business partnership, and sharing a bed with the comfortable affection of people who had chosen each other deliberately and completely. The legal formalities felt less urgent than the daily reality of their commitment. "We should probably make it official before Caspian comes home," Aubriana said one evening, as if reading his thoughts. "For practical reasons, if nothing else. Insurance, medical decisions, all the paperwork that comes with parenting." "Is that a yes to my very romantic labor room proposal?" Miles asked with a grin. "That's a yes to spending our lives together," Aubriana replied, turning to kiss him softly. "Though I might want a slightly more dignified ceremony for the actual wedding." Rihanna, who had been eavesdropping from her bedroom window directly above the porch swing, stuck her head out to contribute to the conversation. "Can I help plan it? I have ideas about flowers and music and what kind of cake we should have." "You're supposed to be asleep, young lady," Miles called up to her. "I can't sleep when you're talking about important family decisions without me," Rihanna replied with unassailable logic. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't mess this up." The wedding, when it finally happened 3 weeks later, was Exactly the kind of understated celebration that reflected who they had become as a family. Pastor Finch officiated in the hospital chapel, with Caspian sleeping peacefully in Aubriana's arms, still small enough to fit in the crook of her elbow, but finally stable enough to be held for extended periods. Rihanna served as both maid of honor and ring-bearer, wearing a dress she'd chosen herself, and carrying a bouquet of winter flowers from the hospital gift shop. The guest list was small, but meaningful. Dr. Hayes and several of the NICU nurses, who had become like family over the previous weeks, Mrs. Vance and a handful of neighbors who had supported them through the crisis, and Miles's sister who had driven down from Portland with her own family to witness the ceremony. Do you, Miles Edward Taylor, take Aubriana Claire Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Miles said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. And do you, Aubriana Claire Hayes, take Miles Edward Taylor to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Aubriana replied, tears sliding freely down her cheeks. By the power vested in me by the state of Oregon, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The kiss was gentle, mindful of the sleeping baby between them, but it carried the weight of everything they had survived and built together. When they broke apart, Caspian stirred slightly in his sleep, and Rihanna applauded with the enthusiasm of someone who had been personally invested in the outcome of the ceremony. Can I hold him now? She asked, already reaching for her new baby brother. The reception was held in the hospital cafeteria, complete with a cake that Mrs. Vance had somehow managed to smuggle past hospital security, and enough flowers to transform the institutional space into something approaching festive. It wasn't the wedding either of them might have imagined as young people, but it was perfect for who they had become: practical, intimate, and focused on the relationships that mattered most. So what's next? Asked Miles's sister, Linda Croft, as they cleaned up paper plates and plastic forks. Home, Miles replied simply. Caspian gets discharged next week, and then we figure out how to be a family of 4 in the real world. The transition to home life proved easier than any of them had expected. Caspian, despite his early arrival, was a remarkably content baby who seemed to thrive on the combination of medical attention and family affection that had characterized his first months of life. He slept through the night within days of coming home, nursed efficiently, and showed the kind of robust development that made his pediatrician beam with professional satisfaction. Some babies are just determined to catch up, Dr. Hayes explained during one of their regular checkups. Caspian appears to be one of those babies. All his milestones are progressing beautifully. Rihanna adapted to big sister responsibilities with the same practical competence she brought to everything else in her life. She learned to sterilize bottles, fold tiny clothes, and sing lullabies that actually seemed to soothe Caspian when he was fussy. More importantly, she had appointed herself the baby's primary advocate and protector, a role she took seriously enough to create a detailed schedule of feeding times, nap requirements, and approved visitors. He can't have too much stimulation, she would inform anyone who wanted to hold Caspian. And you have to support his head properly because his neck muscles are still developing. The hardware store had become a kind of community center during the months of family transition. Customers would stop by not just for supplies, but to check on Caspian's progress, offer parenting advice, and share their own stories of unexpected family formations. The emergency preparedness section that Aubriana had envisioned proved immediately popular, with rural residents appreciating the opportunity to consult with someone who understood both the practical and psychological aspects of crisis planning. It's like having our own personal disaster response expert, commented Ragnar Reed, who owned a small ranch outside town. Aubriana helped me set up a communication plan that actually makes sense for my property. Most of the emergency management stuff is designed for suburban areas. The success of the business expansion allowed them to hire part-time help, which gave them more flexibility for family time, while still maintaining the personal service that had made Taylor & Hayes Hardware a trusted community resource. Devlin Thorne, a recent high school graduate with mechanical aptitude and genuine enthusiasm for customer service, proved to be exactly the kind of employee they needed, responsible enough to handle the store independently, but young enough to appreciate learning from their combined expertise. By spring, their life had settled into the kind of sustainable rhythm that Miles had always hoped for, but never quite believed was possible. Morning routines that included feeding Caspian, getting Rihanna ready for school, and opening the store for the early customers who liked to start their projects before the day got too warm. Afternoon family time when they could walk to the park with the stroller, work in the garden that Aubriana had started behind the house, or simply sit on the porch and watch their children play in the yard that finally felt like it had enough life to fill it properly. "Do you ever think about the accident?" Aubriana asked one evening as they watched Rihanna push Caspian swing with the gentle attention of someone who understood that trust was earned through consistent kindness. "All the time," Miles replied honestly. "But not in the way you might expect." "What do you mean?" "I think about how it brought us together, but also about how it almost didn't happen. If I'd left 5 minutes later, if I'd taken a different route, if you'd decided to wait another day before trying to find me." He paused, considering the profound randomness of chance encounters. "It makes me grateful for fog, which is probably the only time in my life I'll ever say that." Aubriana laughed, the sound carrying across the yard to where Rihanna was teaching Caspian to clap his hands. "I think about the fog too. How it hid everything except what mattered most." "What mattered most?" "The fact that some people will stop to help, even when they don't know what they're getting themselves into." She turned to look at him directly. "You saved my life that day, Miles, not just from the accident, but from the life I was living before. Always moving, always temporary, always preparing for the next ending instead of building something permanent." "We saved each other," Miles corrected. "You and Rihanna and Caspian. You gave me a reason to believe in more than just getting through each day." As the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded Millbrook Heights, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Miles felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had learned to recognize happiness when it arrived. Not the dramatic, overwhelming joy of major life events, but the quieter, more sustainable contentment that came from daily choices to love and support the people who mattered most. It was the kind of evening that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier, when his world had been bounded by routine and resignation instead of possibility and purpose. Now watching his wife help their daughter teach their son to appreciate the simple pleasure of warm air and gentle motion, Miles understood that some of the most important transformations happened not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulated weight of ordinary moments that somehow added up to extraordinary grace. 5 years later, the October fog rolled down from the Cascade foothills, just as it had that morning 5 years ago. But this time Miles Taylor Hayes watched it approach from the warmth of his expanded hardware store, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, and the satisfied feeling of someone who had learned to appreciate the beauty in unexpected weather patterns. "Daddy, look." 4-year-old Caspian pressed his face against the front window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the mist swirl around the parking lot. "It's like clouds decided to visit the ground." "That's exactly what it is, buddy," Miles replied, ruffling his son's dark hair that reminded him so much of Aubriana's. Caspian had grown into a sturdy, curious little boy whose early arrival seemed to have instilled in him an appreciation for making the most of every moment. He approached the world with the kind of fearless enthusiasm that came from being deeply loved from his very first breath. "Is Mama coming back soon?" Caspian asked, peering through the fog toward the community center across the street where Aubriana was leading her monthly emergency preparedness workshop. "Any minute now," Miles assured him. "And then we'll all go pick up Rihanna from violin." Practice. The afternoon routine had become as comfortable and predictable as breathing. Aubriana had built her emergency consulting business into something that served not just Millbrook Heights but the entire county, offering workshops on everything from wildfire evacuation planning to winter storm preparedness. Her approach combined practical skills with psychological resilience training, drawing on both her service experience and her understanding of how ordinary families could prepare for extraordinary circumstances. "She has a gift for making people feel capable instead of scared," Kaylin Croft had told Miles just last month. The paramedic who had responded to Aubriana's accident had become a close family friend, and one of Aubriana's regular workshop participants. Most emergency training focuses on worst-case scenarios. Aubriana teaches people how to be confident and ready without living in fear. The hardware store had evolved far beyond what Miles had originally envisioned when he'd first inherited it from his father. The emergency preparedness section now took up nearly a quarter of the retail space, stocked with everything from basic first aid supplies to sophisticated communication equipment. But more importantly, it had become a gathering place for the community, somewhere people came not just to buy supplies, but to learn skills, share information, and connect with neighbors who understood that being prepared was an act of caring for each other. "Mr. Miles!" The bell above the door chimed as Phelan Reed burst in, her cheeks red from the cold and her eyes bright with excitement. At 8 years old, she was one of Rihanna's closest friends and had appointed herself an unofficial junior employee of the hardware store, always eager to help organize inventory or explain products to customers who seemed confused. "Hi there, Phelan. What brings you by on such a foggy afternoon?" "Mama sent me to get weather stripping for our back door. She says the cold air is sneaking in and making our heating bill too expensive." Phelan paused to wave at Caspian, who waved back enthusiastically from his perch by the window. "Also, I wanted to ask if Rihanna can sleep over on Friday. We're working on a secret project for the school science fair." "What kind of secret project?" Miles asked, already knowing that any collaboration between Rihanna and Phelan was likely to be both ambitious and slightly chaotic. "We're building a model emergency shelter that can be assembled in under 5 minutes, Phelan announced proudly. "Rihanna designed the support structure, and I'm working on the weatherproofing. Mrs. Aubriana said she'd help us test it when we're ready." Miles smiled, recognizing his wife's influence in the project. Aubriana had a talent for encouraging the people around her, adults and teenagers, alike, to think practically about preparedness without becoming anxious about it. She approached emergency planning the same way she approached parenting, with calm competence, realistic expectations, and an unshakable belief that people were capable of rising to meet challenges when they had the right tools and support. "Think a sleepover can be arranged," Miles said, walking Phelan over to the weather stripping display. "How much do you need?" As he helped Phelan calculate the length of weather stripping required for her family's back door, Miles found himself thinking about how much had changed since that foggy morning when a car accident had transformed his carefully controlled life into something far more complex and infinitely richer. The hardware store had tripled its revenue, employed 6 people, and earned recognition from the state as a model for rural emergency preparedness retail. But more importantly, it had become exactly what he'd always hoped it could be, a place where people could find not just the supplies they needed, but the knowledge and confidence to take care of themselves and their families. The door chimed again, and Aubriana entered with the brisk energy of someone who had just spent 2 hours teaching practical skills to people eager to learn. She was followed by Linda Croft, Miles's sister, who had driven down from Portland for the workshop and was staying the weekend to help with Caspian's birthday party preparations. "How did it go?" Miles asked, accepting the kiss Aubriana offered, as she passed by on her way to greet Caspian. "Wonderful turnout," she replied, scooping their son into her arms for the kind of enthusiastic hug that always made Caspian giggle. 23 people, including 3 families who just moved here from California. They're all motivated to get prepared before winter really sets in. "Any interesting questions?" Mrs. Peterson asked about setting up a neighborhood communication network in case cell towers go down during an ice storm, Aubriana said, settling Caspian on her hip with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to multitask while parenting. "And young Zephyr Sterling wants to organize a group camping trip focused on primitive skills. I think we might have inspired some people to take their preparedness seriously." Linda watched this domestic exchange with the fond amusement of someone who remembered when Miles had been convinced he was destined for a life of careful solitude. "You two have built something really special here," she said. "Not just the business, but the whole community around it." "It wasn't really us," Aubriana replied. "The community was already here, already caring about each other. We just gave people a way to turn that caring into practical action." It was typical of Aubriana to deflect credit for her own contributions, but Miles knew better. Her workshops had transformed the way Millbrook Heights approached emergency preparedness, moving it from an abstract concern to a shared community value. Families who had never talked to their neighbors before were now coordinating supply purchases, sharing skills, and creating informal networks of mutual support that strengthened everyone's resilience. "Speaking of the community," Linda said, "I heard some interesting news at the workshop. Something about a county-wide recognition program." Miles and Aubriana exchanged glances. They'd been keeping the news quiet until all the details were finalized. But Linda's detective instincts, honed by 20 years as a social worker, were too sharp to fool for long. "The County Emergency Management Office nominated us for the state's Community Resilience Excellence Award," Aubriana explained. "We find out next month if we won. And if you do win, a $50,000 grant to expand emergency preparedness programs in rural communities," Miles said. "We could outfit a mobile training unit, travel to other small towns, help them develop their own preparedness networks." Linda clapped her hands together with genuine excitement. "That's incredible! You could help communities all over the region." The possibility was both thrilling and daunting. Miles and Aubriana had spent long evenings discussing what winning the award might mean for their family, their business, and their commitment to Millbrook Heights. The travel requirements would be significant, but they'd figured out ways to manage it, taking Caspian with them during school breaks, coordinating schedules so one parent could always be home with Rihanna, perhaps even incorporating educational travel into the teenagers' homeschooling curriculum. "We'll see what happens," Aubriana said with characteristic pragmatism. "For now, we're focused on getting ready for Caspian's birthday party and making sure everyone in town is prepared for winter." The mention of the birthday party prompted Caspian to launch into an elaborate description of his party plans, which involved a treasure hunt, a cake shaped like a fire truck, and the presence of every person he'd ever met. His enthusiasm was infectious, and soon all 4 adults were contributing suggestions for party games and debating the logistics of accommodating what appeared to be a guest list of approximately half the town. "Can we invite Officer Quinn?" Caspian asked. He said he might be able to bring the police car with the lights on. "We'll see, buddy," Miles said, making a mental note to call Maelstrom Quinn about coordinating a special appearance. The police officer had become a regular participant in Aubriana's workshops and had developed a particular fondness for Caspian, who was fascinated by anything involving emergency vehicles. As they prepared to close the store and head home for dinner, Miles found himself reflecting on the strange alchemy of timing and choice that had brought them to this moment. 5 years ago, his life had been defined by careful routines designed to minimize risk and unpredictability. Now he was married to a woman whose job involved preparing for disasters, father to 4-year-old who approached every day as an adventure, and stepfather to a 14-year-old who had inherited both her biological mother's artistic talent and her adoptive mother's practical competence. The drive home took them past Whispering Pine Cemetery, where a small memorial marker honored the memory of Sarah, Rihanna's biological mother, who had died in a climbing accident in Colorado 2 years earlier. They'd gotten the call on a Tuesday evening, and while the grief was complicated by years of abandonment and anger, Rihanna had insisted on creating a memorial in Millbrook Heights for the mother she barely remembered, but had never stopped loving. "Do you think Mama Sarah would like our family now?" Rihanna had asked Aubriana while they were designing the memorial together. "I think she would be proud of the person you've become," Aubriana had replied with the careful honesty that characterized all her interactions with Rihanna's complicated feelings about her biological mother. "And I think she would be grateful that you have so many people who love you." The memorial had become a place where Rihanna could process her feelings about loss and belonging, often bringing flowers or small drawings that she would leave by the marker. Aubriana had never tried to replace Sarah in Rihanna's heart, understanding instinctively that love multiplied rather than divided, that there was room in their family for honoring the past while building the future. Now, at 14, Rihanna moved through the world with the kind of confident kindness that came from being secure in her place, within a family that had chosen each other deliberately and completely. She played violin in the regional youth orchestra, maintained a 4.0 GPA, and had started teaching basic emergency preparedness skills to younger students at her school. More importantly, she had appointed herself Caspian's primary teacher, importantly. Everything from shoe tying to storytelling, approaching big sister responsibilities with the same practical competence that characterized everything she did. Rihanna texted, Aubriana said, checking her phone as they pulled into their driveway. "Violin practice ran long, but they'll be finished in 20 minutes. She wants to know if we can pick up pizza on the way home." "Pizza sounds perfect," Miles replied, appreciating the simple pleasure of a family dinner plan that required no more coordination than a quick stop at Torvin's Pizza on their way back from town. Their house had evolved along with their family, expanding from the modest 3-bedroom craftsman into something that could accommodate the realities of a busy household with 2 working parents and 2 active youngsters. They'd added a sunroom where Aubriana could work on training materials, and Rihanna could practice violin without disturbing Caspian's naps. The backyard now included a vegetable garden, a play structure that Miles had built with help from Rihanna, and the tree house that had been their family project. The morning Caspian decided to arrive early. "I want to show Aunt Linda my room," Caspian announced as they pulled into the driveway, already unbuckling his car seat with the determined independence of someone who had mastered the task just last month. "After dinner," Aubriana said. "First we need to pick up your sister and get some food into everyone." As they drove back into town to collect Rihanna and acquire pizza, Miles found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Dr. Hayes just last week during Caspian's annual checkup. The physician who had delivered Caspian and supported their family through those early NICU weeks had become not just their doctor, but a trusted friend whose own family often joined them for community events and holiday celebrations. "You know," Dr. Hayes had said while reviewing Caspian's growth charts, "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've learned that some of the most important healing happens not in hospitals, but in homes, where people choose to love each other well." "What do you mean?" Miles had asked. "I mean that Caspian's early birth could have been a crisis that tore your family apart. The stress, the uncertainty, the financial pressure, the disruption to your plans. Instead, it became the foundation for something stronger. That kind of resilience doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people decide that their commitment to each other is more important than their fear of what might go wrong." The observation had stayed with Miles, particularly as he watched Aubriana navigate the complexities of running a business, raising two teenagers, and preparing their community for emergencies that might never come. She approached uncertainty, not with anxiety, but with practical preparation and unshakable confidence in their family's ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. "You're thinking deep thoughts," Aubriana observed as they waited in the pickup line outside the music school. "Just grateful," Miles replied honestly, "for all of it. The accident, the fog, the early labor, even the difficult parts. All of it. Let us hear. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met under different circumstances? If you'd called me after the Fort Braxton weekend, or if I'd found your contact information when I first realized I was pregnant?" Miles considered the question, watching through the windshield as Rihanna emerged from the music school building with her violin case slung over her shoulder and a smile that lit up her entire face when she saw their truck. "I think we would have found each other eventually," he said finally. "Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same timing, but I think some connections are strong enough that they find a way to happen. Even across fog and car crashes and stubborn people who think they're better off alone." "Especially then," Miles replied, reaching over to take her hand as Rihanna approached the truck. "Some of the best things in life come disguised as problems we think we can't handle." Rihanna climbed into the back seat with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable with her place in the world. "How was everyone's day?" she asked, already reaching forward to ruffle Caspian's hair in the affectionate way that always made him beam with big sister adoration. "Good," Caspian replied. "Daddy and I watched the fog, and Mama taught people how to be ready for emergencies. And Aunt Linda came to visit, and we're getting pizza." "Sounds like a perfect day," Rihanna said, settling back in her seat with the satisfied expression of someone whose life was filled with exactly the right amount of ordinary happiness and extraordinary love. As they drove toward Torvin's Pizza, through streets made mystical by the evening fog, Miles felt the profound contentment that came from recognizing that his life had become everything he'd never known he wanted. Not the careful, controlled existence he'd planned before Aubriana crashed into his world, but something messier, more complicated, and infinitely more alive. The fog swirled around their truck like a benediction, transforming the familiar roads of Millbrook Heights into something magical and new, just as it had on that October morning 5 years ago, when chance and weather and the willingness to stop for someone in need had changed everything. Some stories, Miles realized, don't end, they just keep expanding, creating new chapters of love and purpose and the beautiful chaos of people who choose each other again and again, through fog and clear skies and everything in between. And in that moment, driving through the mist with his wife beside him and his teenagers laughing in the back seat, Miles understood that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simple decision to pull over and help, to stay when leaving would be easier, and to believe that love is always worth the risk of letting it change everything you thought you knew about what home could be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.